Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salado Makwidi. The time is 14 minutes past 9 Central African time. And we're going to be switching gears now to a very, very important conversation, a stark warning from Amnesty International, the human rights group. They're saying human rights across the world are not just under pressure, they are on a decline. In the latest State of the World's Human Rights Report, the organization points to what it calls a growing anti-rights global order that is marked by repression, it is marked by dissent and weakening of international law and deepening inequality. And here at home in South Africa, the picture is equally complex. Persistent gender-based violence, GBV, a scourge that is taken over the country, and failures in service delivery, threats against activists and whistleblowers, and ongoing inequality continue to raise serious red flags. So while South Africa positions itself as a defender of human rights globally, we've seen the ICJ case against Israel being the most notable one in recent years. Questions are now being asked about its record domestically, human rights violations in South Africa, and them being a very, very key point of concern. And we're going to be unpacking more on that, and we'll be joined by Cassandra Dorasamy, campaigner at Amnesty International South Africa, to unpack a bit on the report, but most importantly, to look a bit inward into South Africa and what we are doing internationally and how it reflects here at home. Are we walking the talk? Charity begins at home, being the most familiar and most relevant phrase in this context. And Cassandra's joining us via our virtual platform. Cassandra, thank you so much for joining us. Good morning. Welcome to News and Views.
Good morning, and good morning to your listeners. Thank you for having us.
No, the pleasure is all ours. And I think we'll jump right into it. If you can just give a short synopsis, I know the report is really long, of Amnesty International's Human Rights Report. If you can just, make it as brief as possible for those that didn't have an opportunity to look at it, to read it. What would you say are some of the most notable factors that you can take out for us?
Sure, I think I can summarize it in a line actually, and that's that the world is entering a new era of complete impunity and lack of accountability and complete respect for international law and the international rules-based order. And we see that in multiple areas of the world. We're seeing it continuously in the genocide in Gaza. We're seeing it in Sudan, where there's still support and involvement from the UAE in the atrocities committed by the Rapid Support Forces. We're seeing it in Venezuela, in the US active aggression against Venezuela, in Iran. So across the world, we are seeing this blatant disregard for international law. And Amnesty International warns in our report that what's unique about this era is that complete lack of impunity and at times almost pride in the lack of regard for international law that's being shown by world leaders.
And I think it's very, very important to note that it doesn't look like there is even shame anymore, to put it loosely, of human rights violations. There's a term that you guys are using, and I think is very, very important. You guys are warning that human rights are on a backslide. How serious is this moment? And in literal practical terms, what does it actually look like?
I think bringing it back to the people who are affected by this backslide, it looks in the context of genocide and in the context of war, it looks like the thousands and almost millions of people who are affected by starvation. It looks like the death toll, the civilian casualties that we're seeing. Practically, when it comes to climate change, for example, with this renewed fight against any form of climate justice that's coming from the Trump administration, it looks like communities that are being affected by extreme weather events, even here in South Africa, not receiving the type of support that they would need. from those who are most responsible for the climate crisis that we're seeing. In terms of women's rights, we're seeing a backslide in access to sexual and reproductive health services, which are important for women's right to health. So in multiple areas, the impact of this erosion of the rights framework that has been built over decades has a very real reality for people in their everyday lives.
Mm, I want to bring it back home. I know you touched on it quite briefly. South Africa. Just looking at the report and the status quo on the ground, where would you say South Africa stands within the global picture? Are we holding the line, or are we slipping, as it were?
Mm. Well, in the international sphere, Amnesty International has commended the South African government for the stance that they've taken against the genocide in Gaza, and in their case against Israel at the ICJ. That's an important step towards justice and accountability for the genocide that's ongoing. But it's an important moment of an important sort of role that South Africa is playing in showing Israel and the US that there has to be accountability. And in the report, we frame the politics type of geopolitics that we're seeing as a form of predatory politics and a politics of appeasement. And South Africa, in their stance on the genocide, has followed neither line and has been bold and courageous in standing up to Israel and to the US. We haven't seen quite the same from other European states. But bringing it back home to South Africa, like you say, we have our own challenges. We have our own rights violations that Amnesty International South Africa continues to document and call for justice and accountability on. So there's no letting the South African government off the hook. But importantly, South Africa still has a strong rights framework. We have the Bill of Rights. We have multiple pieces of legislation that protects and is meant to be used in the enforcement of rights. And we as people living in South Africa need to continue to pay attention to the ways in which people might try to erode those rights, and push for amendments or push for the exclusion of certain people from access to those rights. And in the report, we highlight, for example, the xenophobic attacks that have prevented migrants from accessing basic healthcare services. So for as long as we have that framework, and as long as we as South African people continue to push for justice and accountability, we the ones who uphold that system. The government has failed on multiple levels to provide access to basic services, for example, to provide justice and accountability for victims of gender-based violence, for victims of crime. We see our high murder rates. And all of those instances are ways in which the South African government needs to do better, but also ways in which us as people living in South Africa need to hold the South African government accountable too.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay on this point because I think it's very, very important. You speak of the strong legal framework that we have here in South Africa, which is all well and good, but you have issues like gender-based violence and persistent inequality that are still plaguing the country. Why does progress remain so slow despite those strong legal frameworks that we have? They're not seemingly making any kind of difference.
Well, I think the Madlanga Commission has put on full display the types of corruption that's going on within our institution that prevents us from, or prevents the South African government from being able to deliver on things like justice. And we see it throughout our government departments. We saw widespread corruption in the Department of Social Development, for example, that prevented people from accessing their basic grants. We've seen it in the Department of Water and Sanitation, where projects that were committed to building infrastructure for communities have never been followed through, and the money has disappeared. So when we see this level of systemic corruption within our institutions, that directly impacts on the government's ability, obviously, to deliver on human rights. So I would pin it down to that, the fact that we have those laws and frameworks. We have budget at times that's being mismanaged, that's being swindled. And there's that institutional lack of capacity and institutional systemic corruption at both levels that's leading to this lack of enforcement of our good laws and legislations that we have.
There's also, I think, concerns about attacks on activists and whistleblowers and community leaders. Just how widespread is this problem, and what needs to be done to mitigate it?
So Amnesty International, along with other partners in South Africa, have been documenting the threats and attacks against human rights defenders. And a human rights defender is anyone who stands up and advocates for human rights for themselves or for their communities. And it also includes people like whistleblowers who expose corruption, and that has a direct impact on the state's ability to deliver on human rights. So in terms of tracking the extent of the issue, there is no formal tracking system, and that's one of the things that Amnesty International South Africa has been calling for, that there is some form of formal recognition of who human rights defenders are, some formal legal protection in legislation that provides a framework for human rights defenders who are at risk to access the forms of protection in their context. And then thirdly, that there is that tracking system for when a human rights defender is threatened or attacked, that formally the state has that record. At the moment, we're seeing I think we can all see from the news and the cases that we've seen only this year of whistleblowers and professionals who are working on corruption cases being killed. But also grassroots activists like the member of Abahlali Basimjondolo from the Enkanini commune in Gauteng, who was killed in February this year. And Amnesty International released a report in 2024, which documented the cases of killing specifically of Abahlali Basimjondolo as a representative of the pattern of threats and attacks that the movement is facing, but also a representative of broader attacks that grassroots human rights defenders are facing, in mining affected communities, for example, or in land disputes and issues such as that.
Would then the reality be the fact that South Africa takes strong opposition and positions on international human rights issues, but there seems to be a contradiction between what's the global stance and the local realities here at home? We don't see as much vigor from government when it comes to tackling those realities that we've mentioned: the protection of the most vulnerable in our society, GBV, and the protection of community leaders and whistleblowers, as it were.
Yes, and I think there's frustration that's been expressed amongst the South African community at times, that there is this double standard, so to speak, that South Africa has taken such a strong stance in the international community, and even at times in their roles in various international mechanisms within the UN. But at home, we still see that our constitution and the promises that it provides versus the realities of millions of people living in South Africa. And like that, we've documented in our Flooded and Forgotten report that we released sometime last year, the impact of climate change and extreme weather events that people living in informal settlements experience. And that's over 5 million people who still live in informal settlements, and of people who struggle to access adequate housing. There's over 3 million people who still don't have access to a basic water supply in South Africa. So the government in their action needs to bridge that gap, and to ensure that here at home we are delivering on our basic constitutional rights.
Let's talk about recourse now. I think it's very, very important. What should accountability look like from now onwards? What needs to change urgently to try and mitigate this backslide that you guys talk about?
Well, I think it's we as Amnesty International are, of course, like an evidence-based legal organization that does research and records instances of human rights violations. But we're also a campaigning movement. We call on members of our movement and the broader public to join in our campaigns for justice and accountability. And I think like going into a local government election year,
mm,
we as South Africans should be reminded of the power that we hold to hold governments accountable. We're seeing, glimmers of inroads into justice and accountability through the Matlanga Commission and through the cases that are coming out of that. But there's so much more that needs to be done. And as long as we need to keep holding government's feet to the fire, so to speak, and to continue where we see injustice speaking out. And government itself, through our international advocacy, we approach UN review mechanisms, we approach the international community in a sense where there is opportunity, like in the Universal Periodic Review process, where countries peer review each other on their delivery of on the rights framework. We try to use those opportunities as well to hold government accountable to their obligations here at home. So it's a really difficult question, and it comes back to one, recapacitating the institutions that are there to
mm,
provide accountability and hold people accountable, like the NPA, and two, and SAPS, and for the investigations that they do that leads to accountability and justice, and two, we as people in South Africa just not taking the nonsense anymore and ensuring
mm.
that we are using our voices and our platforms to continue to call for justice and accountability.
In closing, if it was a report card out of 10, how much would South Africa be getting when it comes to human rights and based on your report?
Wow, I think I'd let people decide for themselves. We cover so many issues. We speak about the eradication of pit toilets, the fact that children are still dying in pit toilets in schools, and that there's no proper plan to eradicate pit toilets in all schools just yet, including early childhood development centers. We talk about communities that are affected by extreme weather events. There's gender-based violence and so many women being killed and raped on a daily basis. It's a low score if we're looking at it from all of the issues that we have reported on this year. And I'd encourage everyone to have a read and reflect on it for themselves too.
It feels like the infamous 30%, Cassandra, but we're going to be there for now. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
There you go, Cassandra Dorasamy, campaigner out at Amnesty International South Africa, giving us, I think, a very sobering but important perspective on where we stand as South Africa when it comes to the state of human rights, both globally and here at home. It's a conversation that needs to continue, and I think it's one that needs a lot of attention. The contradictions, I think, is the most, concerning element for me. The fact that South Africa can stand head and shoulders above everyone else to hold countries like Israel, the United States of America accountable for their actions in Gaza and other different parts of the world. But right here at home, the picture is still very, very disheartening. Level of inequality, poverty, level of education and access, and it's really concerning, and I think it's one that us as South Africans need to speak more about. There's nothing wrong with speaking about injustice in the global stage. In fact, it is a responsibility that a country like South Africa has, considering the history that we come from, but also charity begins at home. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, we shift our attention to humanitarian action. Qurbani season is beginning with millions preparing to give, but they're doing so against the backdrop of a deepening hunger crisis. And we're going to be speaking to Halima Moyes from Islamic Relief South Africa on what's at stake this year, and most importantly, how you can get involved. Stay with us. This is News and Views.